You are listening to Processing Trauma Out Loud, conversations about trauma and healing from two women who are doing the work.
Hey everyone, it's Kandace and Sher with Processing Trauma Out Loud. We are so happy to be back with you this week to tackle a new topic. Sher, we had a conversation this morning about the idea of what does it mean, there's a few different ways we can look at this, that we feel fragile, or on the flip side, what does it mean to feel resilient? So what causes us to have that fragileness very easily triggered and triggered a lot and feel like you have no control over anything. So we will say that would be pretty fragile, or you have high levels of resilience. Not that you still can't feel things, but you really have this ability to kind of know what's yours, know what's not, and know what to do with it and stay very grounded. How is that set up, Cher?
And I want to also clarify that by fragile, we're kind of thinking in terms of attachment. And what do we do when we're dysregulated in our attachment? Do we become anxious? Do we become avoidant? Or kind of a combination that disorganized attachment? The reason why I want to really point that out is because sometimes that person who has avoidant attachment does not feel fragile. They feel strong. Right. They feel in control. They remove themselves, right? Or they shut things down. But there's a fragility in that too. It's the sense that I cannot stay engaged in this relationship that at the moment has some level of feeling like I'm being triggered.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. I was actually going to just do a little personal example. When I look back on my 35-year marriage history, I see that very young, fragile girl that really was leaning more towards anxious attachment, especially in the beginning. Now I identify more with the fearful avoidant, where I can ebb and flow pretty quickly, honestly, back and forth. But I was more in this anxious style of relating, which felt very fragile. It's this looking for, am I okay? It's this over preoccupation with the relational status. Mm-hmm. And instead of, if you have a secure attachment, you're not all balled up inside, even if there is a little bit of rupture. You're able to, you have more resilience, right? But I love what you're pointing out about for the avoidant, it's the same fragileness. It just presents differently.
One of the things that kind of spurred on this conversation was one of our pearls, the women in our healing community offered a poem where it kind of talked about how when the vase is shattered and then the pieces are brought together, that where the pieces are joined with, particularly if it's with gold or some kind of a really, well, I don't know, gold isn't even a strong, isn't typically a strong metal, but when the pieces are joined together, where the joins are, the vase is actually the strongest. Mm. And that's causing me to really ponder how when we have trauma, we do feel fragile, we feel breakable, and we're really afraid, whether consciously or subconsciously, we're really afraid of anything that's going to shatter us because we don't feel like we could overcome that. And so we have all of our brilliant ways that we self-protect against being shattered. And so that, again, that might mean being anxious, where we're trying really hard to make things better and communicate and figure out what's wrong. Or we might go to the avoidant and just throw up the wall and be like, nope, I'm out of here. Mm-hmm. But if we can recognize that the shattering doesn't have to be the end. And I want to say that really carefully, because what I'm not talking about here is putting ourselves in dangerous situations or putting ourselves in places that are too hard, right? I am not saying that. For sure, we talk all the time about self-care and having boundaries. But what I am talking about is being able to stay a little longer being able to take a little more risk, being able to establish a boundary rather than just checking out.
Yeah, I want to go back to real quick how a child develops resilience. And because that's where our template is set. And a child that grows up with more resilience, which we'll call a secure connection, that's a child that hasn't been parented perfectly, but they have been parented in a way where there is a little bit of letting the child struggle in this. I'm not talking about a baby, but age appropriate, allowing them to move forward and even fail, helping them back up, literally, if they're learning how to walk. This is just a little analogy here. Not letting that be too much, whatever that age appropriate or developmental stage is for them. And then always helping them in that moment. Like, you're not going to be alone in taking this risk. You're going to be supported. If a child consistently has that growing up, whether it's even in sports or their relationships, in every sphere of life, that child is going to grow up to be a resilient adult. When a child does not have that, they're left alone in the struggle.
Yeah.
Maybe they're pushed so hard that they literally give up. Maybe they're not at all challenged and believe, well, nobody thinks I can really do anything. Everything's always being done for me.
Mm.
It is this getting educated developmentally.
Yeah.
There's so many resources out there about this. What is my child able to do physically, emotionally, mentally? And then just don't have to do it perfectly, but kind of follow that pathway. That's going to be a child that has resilience.
And I think, and I love you talking about this. And I want to point out too that so often our trauma can begin at very, very early. And particularly when our primary caregivers do not respond to the cry of the baby, do not respond to the toddler or the 3 or the 4 or the 5-year-old, right? Those early years of life when big emotions are not tended to, or where the child expresses some level of need and either no one is there or no one is responsive. This for a child helps the child recognize that when I have a need, I'm going to either have to figure it out on my own or I'm going to have to get really anxious. Or I do get really anxious until I can figure out a way to get somebody to hear me. And so it's that then that we're carrying forward into, later in our teenage years or our adult years, where we often find ourselves relating in ways with the people who we love, and we don't. Maybe we don't like the way we're relating, or we struggle with the things that dysregulate us. We don't know why, and we don't know what to do.
So, what we don't want to do is we don't want to coddle everything. This creates a fragility within the child that they don't think that they can handle anything hard. But we also don't want to push them into the other extreme that it's too hard for them. You used analogy a long time ago in one of our podcasts, and I don't think I'd ever heard you say it before, and it still is in my mind at times. Am I putting a 30-pound backpack on a child and throwing them into the pool and telling them to swim?
Yeah.
It's too much. I don't know if that makes sense in this space, but it feels like, if you don't know, is this pushing my child too much or am I coddling my child? Just do a little research on it. I'll tell you, Dan Siegel would be my go-to. Like, if I would have had Dan Siegel when I was parenting my littles, I would have eaten his stuff up.
I love that. And the resources are so available. I think it's good to really ponder what you're talking about here, Kandace, because again, what we really want to be thinking about in this space of, how fragile am I? How resilient am I? In other words, how much risk can I tolerate in my relationships? And to go back to thinking in terms of at what times in my relationships, in which relationships do I feel that sense that I have the 30-pound backpack on, I'm trying to swim and I'm going under and something has to happen. How often do I find myself there? And then what do I do to survive the moment?
I'm thinking about some recent text conversations that we've had in our Pearls group, and we will often say, each one of us at various times, now that I have these secure connections, I feel like I can take risks in other relationships that I want to see more for or from. So to me, it's like, okay, well, if you have a 30-pound backpack on and you have someone on both of your sides and you're bearing that weight together, that's what we do for one another. We're bearing these weights together, these relationships together,
Yeah.
to where if I step out and risk and I get shattered or wounded or rejected, I just don't feel alone anymore. It doesn't mean I wouldn't feel sad. It wouldn't mean that I wouldn't have grief. But my little girl that used to think, am I going to survive this?
Yeah.
She knows now. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
This hurts and we will be okay. Wow, I just felt emotional about that.
I'm really hearing you too, Candace. And I want to make a big point of this because we now know secure attachment. Like we have it with each other. We have it in several of our relationships. We have it with a whole group of us. There's security in the way we relate together. There's security in the way and having that space where we can bring up the things that we're struggling with and just put it out there and say, wow, this thing happened and this is how I responded. And it has been profoundly impacting for me because a lot of times what I think and see is not what you think and see. And sometimes when you tell me what you think and see, there's a part of me that's like, no, that's not it. But
Yeah.
but then I will ponder and I'll be like, well, or could that be a part of what's going on here? And sometimes I put myself in a situation where you or the pearls will say, wow, I'm feeling protective over you. Like, tell me more about why you want to move toward that? Or the opposite, if I'm pulling back and you might say, oh, I wonder, what are you feeling something there that's connected to your story? Having that kind of help is, again, I will just say profoundly impacting.
One thing that we have witnessed, within our own close relationships, but I'm going to say, with our clients and our groups, is that if a woman has come into a group historically being isolated and being alone,
Yeah.
probably covered in a lot of shame, a lot of fear, she oftentimes, we discover, maybe her primary relationship with a partner or spouse is very toxic, or a friendship or something. So we don't tell them, you need to get out of that. But what happens, or do we tell them you have to stay? But what happens, we see some healing, and then the resilience of knowing you're not alone, you're going to be okay now. Healing trauma, it's disruptive.
Yeah.
It's disruptive to those relationships that don't have to be over, but they do have to be confronted if you want to experience goodness and you want that for the other person too. I'm gonna just say sometimes people from the outside looking in will judge. Well, their relationship was great until they started doing this work. Well, you probably don't really understand or know everything about the relationship.
No, and I will just say, like, case in point, like, and I won't name the name, but a very, very close relationship that I had with a friend for years, literally years, close person. I was with her a lot and I didn't know that there were things going on. And then when I found out that she was moving toward divorce, I was surprised. And I said, man, I didn't know. And she said, oh, I know. I became perfect at hiding it. And we do,
All the
right?
time.
when we feel fragile, we have all of our ways that we self protect, and even keeping truth away from the people who are closest to us because we feel we cannot bear the exposure of going there.
Yeah, I think I'm owning with just tenderness and praying for just the confident humility of saying, I do take risks to disrupt and to instigate for the good. And even as I say that, I have this awareness that, yeah, you can be an asshole when you do stuff like that. That's not what I'm talking
Mm.
about. I'm talking a little bit with a little bit of trembling of the risks that we take to say, this isn't okay anymore.
Yeah. Mm.
And to say, will you look at this with me? Because I want something different for both of us. And I've noticed that a lot of women that are drawn to work with me need that strength in me,
Yeah.
as I have needed women that can kind of help me breathe. Is this a real threat and danger? Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Because I will power up in the flash of lightning. And I love that I can own there's goodness to that, but in my unhealed trauma, it has hurt people, and I can own that too. What
Mm.
about you when you think of people that are drawn to you? And I think we've had this conversation in a different way, but have you noticed there's people that are drawn to you that are kind of pulling on something that is really your gift?
Mm. Yeah.
I kind of already know what I kind of come to you for, but anyway, go
Well, maybe
ahead.
you should tell me because I'm like, you're putting me on the spot here to name that. Yeah.
I did, but can you? I just want to say, when I come to you really dysregulated,
Mm.
what have you done for me, Cher?
Well, I love to attune. I really love to see, hear you, see you, soothe you like that. I love to do that.
And your ability to tap into a real steadiness,
Yeah. What is true? Like I like to come to that a lot. Not only what is true in you,
right?
but when we're talking about these hurtful relationships, I think sometimes it's really hard for women, particularly, to say, here is what is true about this person. And a lot of times I'll ask, like, if you were to just list the things that you have seen and experienced, let's just take like the last 10 days,
Yeah.
write down what is true in phrases. This. Okay. If those things are true in the last 10 days, like, and you have, and in 3 minutes, you came up with a list of 15 things that, were hurtful. Like, could you then say that maybe the relationship with this person is actually hurting you? And
Yeah, you do
sometimes,
that. You do that well, but I want to add it for me, being an 8 and then you're a 9 on the Enneagram, I lean into your more calm demeanor at
yeah.
times, to where just your presence, I feel like I can calm down a little bit.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like, you don't even really have to say much.
I'll just be here. Yeah. No, I think it's true. Like I
Yeah,
am. I agree with you. Like I can in those kind of moments. I mean, I've had people tell me a lot of times if I'm ever in the middle of a tragedy, I want you there.
that's
Like,
what I'm saying.
yeah,
That's what I'm
I can
saying.
be super calm and I can really hold things together. And I like to be in that space when people are dysregulated and I can just say, okay, let's breathe. Let's just start with breathing step by step by step and then come to the space where the clarity can come and you can begin to work through what's going on.
All of this has built resilience. And I think this is where we can kind of wrap it up and say, what's a question that comes to mind, like for our listeners,
Mhm.
in light of, what we shared on this episode, and then even thinking about your attachment. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
I would leave it with, and we've kind of said this a couple of times, but am I fragile? And what does that look like? Am I fragile? How fragile am I? How is that showing up? And then, and let's even put it on the scale of fragile being on one end and resilient being on the other. And resilient meaning not that I don't hurt, not that when I'm broken or challenged or whatever, that not that that doesn't hurt. I'm not saying that. Fragile meaning I go into my dysregulated attachment styles. I'm making a long explanation here of this question. Resilient being I can trust that there's more security here and I can stand with a sense of sureness, even when things are rocky or hard. So where do I fall on that scale of I'm fragile versus I'm resilient? And then when I recognize where I am, like, how might I be able to move toward resilience and gaining that sense of more security in more secure attachment?
Well, you know that I like a good scale.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to add really quick if it's okay. Okay, so you say fragile at one end and resilient at the other. So fragile is not tenderness. That's different because you can be resilient and tender, and you can be fragile and hardened.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about tender. I want to be tender and strong.
Yeah.
I want to know that I can still feel the breaking,
Yeah.
the grieving. I mean, we have a horrible tragedy happening in our community right now. I don't ever want to not be able to weep with those who weep.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
That's not fragile. That's like tender.
Right. Yeah. We're talking here about fragile being going into self protection because
Yeah.
I can't bear the thought of the shattering.
Maybe I needed to say that more than I needed to explain it, but
It's okay. It's a good review point, Candace. And what I think we are putting words to something that we're just kind of processing too. We're processing out loud here today. And that's good. And I hope it's helpful for our listeners, even as we kind of play with some of the vocabulary here. But I think there's a lot here that's really worthy to consider. So,
me too, friend. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you too, Candace. Love you so much.
Love you too.
Thank you for listening to Processing Trauma Out Loud. Make sure to check out the show notes for links to suggested resources and social media. Like, subscribe, and follow to keep up with our weekly content. And if you don't mind, take a moment to rate and review us. Your feedback is extremely valuable and contributes to the success of this podcast. One last thing. If you have found this podcast helpful in any way, or if you have questions on how to take the next steps on your healing journey, please reach out to us via email at KandaceSher@gmail.com. That's KandaceSher@gmail.com. Our sound engineer is Jeremiah Jones of Auditory LLC. We welcome you to join us for more conversations soon. Take care.